So we have our character class, but it doesn't really look like a character because we don't have a character model assigned to our mesh component. So let's take a look at fixing this. Let's come back to our content browser, and in the main content folder, we will see that we have a folder named characters. Inside this folder, we have another folder for the marine. So let's enter this folder, and we can see that we have three assets here. We're going to focus on the asset that's just named marine that has the pink thumbnail. This isn't a static mesh like what we've been working with in the previous sections. This is a skeletal mesh. Skeletal meshes are assets that have a skeleton, also known as a rig. Skeletal meshes can be animated. Now, we won't be creating the animations ourselves because that's a whole other area of development that would be handled by animators. However, our marine does come with animations that we can use. The animations drive the bones of the skeleton, and as a result, the bones move parts of the mesh. So let's open up our skeletal mesh asset for the marine so we can see him for the first time. So here we go, we are looking at the skeletal mesh asset here. And if you're opening this for the first time, it might take a moment to load and it might also be compiling some shaders for you. So you might have to just wait a moment while the shaders compile, so feel free to pause here. Looking at the top right bar of this interface, we can switch between different tabs. We can select the animation tab to view the animations that come with this asset. And we can preview the different animations by double clicking on them in the asset viewer in the bottom right corner of the interface. So here we can see that the mesh isn't just static, but it gets animated. We can also view the skeleton for this character by switching over to the skeleton tab, and we can see a breakdown of all the individual bones of the character. And when we select a bone from this list, we see the bone highlighted in the character's mesh. Okay, so this is the character we're going to be using. We can close down all these tabs, and let's take a look at how we can assign him to our character blueprint. Let's come back to our marine blueprint. We want to assign the marine skeletal mesh to this mesh component slot. So let's select the component, and let's look towards the details panel. We can simply drop down the skeletal mesh slot to assign the marine character mesh that we just viewed. Now when we do this, the asset is not going to be in the correct place because the pivot point of the mesh component is in the center of the capsule component. So we're going to move this down. I'm going to bring it down to about 90 units here. And we can also see that the character is not facing forwards. This is where this arrow component comes in handy for us. So we want to rotate this character by 90 degrees so it faces the right way, the same way as this arrow. Okay, great. Now let's take a look at adding our own little touch to this character. With the character selected, we can see the character's material slot on the details panel. Let's hit this little magnifying glass so it takes us to where the material exists in our project. Instead of opening this material, we're going to take a look at creating a material instance from it. I'm attaching the material instance page from the Unreal Engine documentation as a resource to this lecture so you can read in depth about material instances in your own time. But the documentation tells us that material instances are used to change the appearance of a material without incurring an expensive recompilation of the material. Basically, this is telling us that we can edit parts of the material in real time without the need of the material having to compile, so we don't have to wait around for the shaders to compile. This marine material has parameters in it that can affect the color of the armor, the lights, and even the glass visor. By creating a material instance, these properties will be exposed for us so we can customize them. Let's take a look. We can create material instances by right-clicking on a material and then selecting Create Material Instance. You can name the material instance, and then once you do, you can open up the asset. Now the interface shows us a preview of the material, and it gives us a details panel where we can edit the material's parameters. However, this material preview isn't really showing us our material in context. We want to see it on our marine character. So to fix this, we can select the marine skeletal mesh from the content browser, and then inside the preview window of the material instance, we can select this teapot icon in the bottom right corner of the preview window to show us our material on the asset we have selected in the content browser. Now we are free to enable the parameters by clicking these checkboxes, and we can click on the colored bars to freely customize the exposed properties of this material. So I want you now to create a material instance for your marine and change the parameters of the material instance to create your own color scheme. So pause here to customize your marine's material. Okay, so here's the color scheme for my marine. I've gone for a blue color scheme with some green lighting on the emissive color. Now, if you actually open up the emissive color, you can make it glow more by increasing the number for this value here. The higher it is, the more it's going to glow. Okay, awesome. So we just need to assign this material instance to the character blueprint now. So we can select our character mesh, and we can change the material to use our material instance. Soon we'll be taking a look at making this character animated, but first let's move into the next lesson to dig into setting up the player camera and some movement input. Okay, so when we press play at the moment, we spawn, but we can't move or do anything because we don't have any logic in our character blueprint. We can also see that we are inside the mesh of our character at the moment. This is because our character blueprint doesn't have a camera component. So by default, Unreal will just set the camera to be at the center of the character. So let's just make sure that we add a camera component now. We're going to go for a top-down camera perspective. So let's open up our marine character and let's add a component, and it's going to be a spring arm, and we can just call this camera spring arm. And we can see that the spring arm is to the center of the character here. We can move it up a bit if we want to, but we're going to rotate this up, so it's not going to matter too much. Now we want to attach a camera to the camera spring arm, and the best way to do this is just by making sure that we have the camera spring arm selected, and we can add the camera component to make it a child of the spring arm. And as we can see, the camera attaches directly on the end of the spring arm there. So we're free to rotate the camera spring arm and change the target arm length to zoom the camera out a bit. And now if we hit compile and save and come back to the level and hit play, we can now see our marine character from our top-down perspective. Now, of course, he's not animated yet. We'll be coming to that shortly, but before we get to that, we first want to get him moving. And to get him moving, we're going to need some input access events. So right now, I want you to pause here and add two input access mappings to map the player movement input. The first input access event is going to be used for moving the player character forwards and backwards, and the second is going to be used for moving the player character right and left. Once we have these input mappings, we can implement the events for them in our character blueprint, so we can start adding some movement input to the character. So pause here and add your two input access mappings for the player movement. Okay, so to add to our input access mappings, we're going to come up to Edit and then Project Settings. Then inside the project settings, we're going to come to the input section. And here is where we can add action mappings and access mappings. We're going to add two axis mappings. One for moving forward, so this is going to be move forward. And moving forward is going to contain the axis values for moving forwards and backwards. And moving right is the next one. And that's going to contain the axis values for moving right and moving left. So to set up these axis values, we first need an input binding. So W is going to be for moving forwards on the keyboard, and then we can add in another axis map to this group, and this is going to be the S key. Let's scroll down till we find S, and we can change the scale here to -1. So when we hold down W, our axis value is going to be 1, and S is going to be -1. Now we're going to do the same for moving right, but right is going to be the D key. So let's find the D key, and then we're going to add another one for the A key for moving left, and the scale value here is going to be -1. Okay, so our input bindings are set up for our keyboard, but what if we have a gamepad like an Xbox controller or just a PC controller? Well, we can add some mappings to the same group for these as well. If we add in a new axis to the group, we can then come to gamepad, and we can scroll down till we find the left thumbstick here. So gamepad left thumbstick Y axis is going to be up and down, so we'll select this. and we can add one for moving right, and the moving right one is going to be the gamepad left thumbstick x-axis. Okay, and that is our axis mappings set up. So let's close our project settings. Now inside our marine character, we can come to the event graph, and within the event graph, we can call the events for our input axis mappings. So we can right click and search for move forward, and we want to make sure we select the axis event. And we can do the same for move right. If we right click, we can search for the axis event for move right. Now, how do we add movement to the character? Well, we can right click and we can come down to the pawn category, and then we can select the input section here, and here are some functions dealing with input. So we can look for the add movement input here. With add movement input, we can provide the movement direction and the scale value as well. So let's just move this function up a bit, and let's connect the execution pin from move forward into this function. And with the axis value of move forward, we're going to hook this up to the scale value. And the world direction that we want the player to move in is going to be 1 for the x. So this means when we press W or S, we're going to be moving along the x-axis, either forwards or backwards. Now let's move the events for move right down, and let's duplicate the add movement input function with Control W to duplicate, and let's hook up the execution pin and connect to the scale value just like before. But the world direction for this event is going to be on the y-axis. When we move right, we want to be moving along the y-axis, so we're going to use the value of 1. Okay, so this is our input setup for moving forwards and backwards, so we can hit compile and save. And now if we come back to the level and hit play, we can see that we can move forwards and backwards, and we can move left and right with the player character. Okay, so we're moving, but what's controlling our movement speed? Well, let's come back to our marine blueprint. Our character movement speed is actually coming from the character movements component. So if we select this and look towards the details panel and scroll down, we can come to the character movement walking category. And on here we have the max walk speed. So this is our movement speed. And if you want to adjust your character speed, you would do that here. Now, it's important to note that the character movement has nothing to do with the character model. You might think that you have an animation of the player running, and that's what makes the character move forwards, but it's not at all. The mesh actually has nothing to do with the character movement. What's happening when we use the add movement input function is we're running some code from the character movement component that basically moves our capsule around the world. It's the capsule that's moving, it's not the character model. The capsule is the root component that moves, and all the components attached to the root component move with it. So we want to start getting our character animated. So in the next lesson, we're going to be taking our first look at animation blueprints. So once you're ready, I'll see you there.